History classrooms often introduce the Vietnam War as a distant jungle conflict framed around ideology, guerrilla warfare, and televised images of soldiers moving through rice paddies. The story usually begins with communism spreading across Southeast Asia and ends with American helicopters lifting off rooftops in Saigon. It is presented as a military failure, a political embarrassment, or a cultural trauma. What is rarely discussed is something far less visible but far more powerful: money. The Vietnam War was never just about bullets, bombs, or borders. It was also about budgets, debt, currency, and an economic system struggling to hold itself together. From the very beginning, the war was shaped by financial forces operating behind closed doors. Decisions that appeared ideological on the surface were often driven by economic pressure underneath. The battlefield was only one front. Another front existed in balance sheets, treasury reports, and international banking systems. That hidden front influenced how long the war lasted, how it was fought, and why it ultimately reshaped the global order. To understand this, it is necessary to step back long before American troops landed in Vietnam, and even before Vietnam became a headline. The roots of the conflict are deeply tied to the world that emerged after World War II, when the United States did not just win a war, but inherited an entire financial system. After World War II, much of Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, industries were crippled, and national economies were exhausted by years of total war. In contrast, the United States emerged stronger than ever. Its factories were intact, its industrial output had expanded dramatically, and it held the majority of the world's gold reserves. More importantly, it held confidence. Nations around the world trusted American economic stability at a time when stability was rare. This moment marked the beginning of the United States as the central economic power of the world. The dollar replaced older currencies as the backbone of international trade. Through agreements like the Bretton Woods system, the dollar became directly linked to gold, and other currencies became linked to the dollar. This created a global financial order where American money was not just national currency, but international infrastructure. In simple terms, the world ran on dollars, and the dollar ran on trust. This new system gave the United States enormous influence. It could lend money, rebuild nations, and shape economic policy far beyond its borders. Programs like the Marshall Plan were not only acts of generosity, but strategic investments. They tied other nations to American economic leadership and ensured that global recovery moved through Washington rather than around it. However, this system came with responsibilities and risks. Maintaining global leadership required constant spending. It required military protection, political intervention, and financial support across the world. The United States was no longer just defending its borders. It was defending an entire economic order. That is where ideology entered the picture. The Cold War is usually described as a battle between communism and capitalism, but ideology alone does not explain the intensity of American involvement across the globe. Communism was not only seen as a political threat. It was perceived as a direct danger to the economic system that placed the dollar at the center of global trade. A world that rejected capitalism could also reject dollar dominance. Vietnam, at first glance, appeared to be another chapter in this ideological struggle. On the surface, it was framed as a fight to stop communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. Political leaders spoke of freedom, democracy, and the domino theory, which warned that if one nation fell to communism, others would follow. But beneath those speeches was a quieter fear: instability. A communist victory in Vietnam threatened more than ideology. It threatened confidence. Confidence in American power. Confidence in American commitments. Confidence in the dollar itself. If the United States failed to protect its interests in one region, allies might begin to question its ability to protect the global system as a whole. This is why Vietnam mattered long before it became a war zone filled with American soldiers. It was not only about Vietnam. It was about credibility. And credibility in a financial system is everything. By the time Vietnam entered American strategic thinking, the United States was already deeply invested in maintaining the post-war order. It had military bases across the world, defense treaties with dozens of nations, and financial obligations that required constant reassurance. Any sign of weakness could ripple through markets, alliances, and currencies. Publicly, leaders spoke about stopping communism. Privately, they worried about markets, trade routes, and international confidence. The language of ideology made decisions easier to sell to the public, but the calculations were often economic. This is where the Real story begins to diverge from what history class usually teaches. The Vietnam War did not begin with soldiers. It began with money flowing into the region. Financial aid, military funding, and economic support were used as tools long before large-scale combat. The United States stepped into Vietnam partly to replace France, whose colonial grip had collapsed under both military defeat and economic exhaustion. France did not lose Vietnam only because it lost battles. It lost Vietnam because it could not afford to keep it. The United States watched this carefully. Allowing another power to fail financially and politically in a strategic region was not seen as an option. Stepping in was framed as assistance, but it was also an investment. Once money was committed, withdrawal became harder. Financial involvement creates momentum, and momentum creates obligation. Each dollar spent increased the cost of backing away. At the same time, the United States was facing pressures at home. It was funding social programs, expanding infrastructure, and promising prosperity to its citizens. Balancing domestic growth with global responsibility required careful economic management. Vietnam would eventually disrupt that balance, but the warning signs were present from the beginning. The government believed it could manage both. It believed that economic strength was endless, that growth would cover costs, and that short-term spending would lead to long-term stability. These assumptions were not unusual in an era when the United States had not yet experienced the limits of global financial leadership. What leaders did not fully acknowledge was how fragile the system actually was. The post-war financial order depended on restraint. It depended on confidence that the United States would not overextend itself. Massive, prolonged military spending threatened that balance. Yet Vietnam gradually pushed the country toward exactly that situation. Still, none of this was explained openly. The public heard about freedom and containment, not deficits and debt. The battlefield images dominated the narrative, while spreadsheets and monetary policy remained invisible. This separation was not accidental. Wars are easier to justify with moral language than with economic truth. Saying a war is necessary to protect freedom sounds noble. Saying it is necessary to protect currency dominance sounds cold, even cynical. So the financial side remained hidden. As the years passed, decisions became less about winning and more about not losing face. Financial pressure mounted quietly. Each escalation required more funding. Each funding decision increased dependence on borrowing and monetary expansion. These choices were often described as temporary, manageable, and reversible. They were none of those things. The war slowly transformed from a strategic intervention into a financial burden. But by then, the cost of withdrawal was no longer measured only in lives or politics. It was measured in credibility. Leaving Vietnam risked signaling weakness to allies and rivals alike. That signal could have economic consequences far beyond Southeast Asia. This is why the war continued long after doubts had set in. Behind every troop increase was a budget decision. Behind every budget decision was an economic assumption. And behind those assumptions was a belief that the United States could afford anything required to maintain leadership. Vietnam would test that belief. By the time American boots hit the ground in large numbers, the outcome was already shaped by years of financial commitments and strategic fears. The war had begun long before the first major battle. It began in conference rooms, treasury departments, and international agreements forged in the aftermath of World War II. The battlefield was simply where those decisions became visible. As this story moves forward, it becomes clear that Vietnam was not an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a global system built on confidence, stretched by ambition, and weakened by the belief that money could always cover consequences. The war that followed would not only challenge military strategy, it would quietly challenge the economic foundation of American power itself. And that challenge began long before the first shot was fired, long before American soldiers marched through Vietnamese villages or helicopters thundered across the jungle sky. Vietnam was already the center of a quiet economic struggle. To understand how the United States became trapped financially before it was trapped militarily, it is necessary to look back at the nation that controlled Vietnam before America ever considered direct involvement: France. For decades, Vietnam was part of French Indochina, a colonial possession that France viewed not only as a strategic territory, but as an economic asset. The region provided raw materials, cheap labor, and commercial opportunities that helped support France's global standing. However, colonial control came at a cost. Maintaining authority over distant territories required constant spending on administration, infrastructure, and military force. As long as France could afford those costs, colonial rule continued. Once it could not, collapse became inevitable. World War II shattered France's ability to sustain its empire. The war drained its treasury, destroyed industrial capacity, and left the country deeply dependent on external financial support. When the war ended, France was no longer a dominant global power. It was a recovering nation struggling to rebuild its own economy. Yet it still attempted to reassert control over Vietnam, hoping to preserve what remained of its colonial prestige and economic interests. This effort was financially unsustainable from the start. The war France fought in Vietnam during the late 1940s and early 1950s was not only a military struggle against Vietnamese independence movements. It was also an economic hemorrhage. Every year, the cost of maintaining troops, equipment, and supply lines grew heavier. French taxpayers bore the burden, and the national budget strained under the pressure. France was fighting a war it could not afford. As costs mounted, France increasingly relied on external assistance, and that assistance came primarily from the United States. Initially, American involvement was presented as limited aid to an ally. However, this aid marked the beginning of a critical shift. By funding France's war effort, the United States was not simply supporting a partner. It was stepping into the financial vacuum left by a collapsing empire. This was the first major step into the economic trap. American policymakers faced a choice: allow France to withdraw and let Vietnam find its own path, or prevent instability by stepping in financially. Stability, in Cold War thinking, was not only a political concept. It was an economic necessity. A sudden collapse in one region could disrupt trade, embolden rival powers, and undermine confidence in Western leadership. Allowing France to fail outright in Vietnam carried risks that extended beyond Southeast Asia. Rather than permitting a clean break, the United States chose gradual replacement. As France's resources dwindled, American funding increased. Weapons, equipment, and financial aid flowed into the region. What had begun as support became substitution. The United States was no longer helping France fight its war. It was effectively paying to keep the conflict going. By the time France suffered its decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the financial reality was clear. France was finished. It could not continue. But the United States, having already invested heavily, was not prepared to step away. This moment was crucial. Instead of allowing Vietnam to stabilize after colonial withdrawal, the United States inherited the financial responsibility of the region. It did so not through conquest, but through accounting. American involvement transitioned from indirect support to direct commitment. Aid programs expanded. Military advisors arrived. Loans and grants became routine. These were described as temporary measures designed to ensure stability and prevent communist influence. In reality, they were long-term financial obligations disguised as short-term solutions. Once money enters a conflict, it changes the nature of decision-making. Each dollar spent created pressure to protect the investment. Withdrawal would not simply mean political embarrassment. It would mean financial loss and strategic uncertainty. Policymakers began to think less in terms of what Vietnam needed, and more in terms of what American credibility required. This mindset was reinforced by Cold War economics. The domino theory is often explained as a political fear. If Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. What is rarely emphasized is the financial dimension of this fear. A region shifting away from Western influence could also shift away from Western economic systems. That shift could affect trade routes, investment flows, and currency stability. Communism was seen not only as an ideological rival, but as an economic disruption. If nations stopped trading in dollars, stopped relying on Western financial institutions, and aligned with alternative systems, American economic leadership could weaken. Vietnam, in this sense, was not just a country. It was a test case. This is why financial aid became inseparable from military planning. Supporting South Vietnam was framed as an investment in regional stability. However, stability required constant funding. Governments needed money to function. Armies needed money to operate. Infrastructure needed money to exist. Aid turned into dependency. Early military spending followed a pattern that would later become familiar. Advisors were sent instead of soldiers. Equipment was provided instead of direct combat. Budgets increased quietly, often approved with minimal public debate. Each increase was justified as necessary to avoid larger costs later. This logic created a dangerous illusion. Because early spending did not involve massive troop deployments, it appeared manageable. Policymakers believed they could control costs, limit exposure, and maintain flexibility. What they failed to recognize was how quickly financial commitments accumulate. Hidden costs multiplied. Training programs expanded. Equipment required maintenance. Local governments required continuous support. Corruption and inefficiency increased expenses without producing results. None of these costs were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a growing financial weight. At the same time, policymakers underestimated duration. They assumed the conflict would be resolved quickly, either through political settlement or limited military pressure. This assumption shaped budget planning. Funds were allocated as if the problem had an expiration date. When that date passed, new funding was added rather than reassessing the strategy. Temporary spending became permanent obligation. This pattern reveals a critical misunderstanding. The United States treated Vietnam as a manageable project rather than an open-ended commitment. It believed economic strength could absorb the cost indefinitely. It believed growth would offset spending. It believed that money spent now would prevent greater spending later. None of these beliefs accounted for escalation. As financial investment grew, so did the need to protect it. Aid alone could not guarantee desired outcomes. Military support increased to safeguard political structures funded by American money. This is how Vietnam transformed from an ally receiving assistance into a responsibility requiring protection. By the early 1960s, the situation had changed fundamentally. The United States was no longer choosing whether to become involved. It was choosing how deeply involved it already was. Vietnam had become a financial obligation. Walking away would mean admitting that years of spending had failed. It would raise questions about judgment, leadership, and reliability. Allies elsewhere might wonder if American promises carried real weight. Markets might question whether American commitments were truly secure. These concerns were rarely spoken publicly, but they shaped decisions behind closed doors. Policymakers found themselves trapped by their own investments. Each new problem demanded more funding. Each funding decision narrowed the range of acceptable outcomes. The war had not yet fully arrived, but the trap had already closed. This is the central truth, often missing from traditional narratives. The Vietnam War did not begin with a military invasion. It began with economic substitution, strategic anxiety, and financial overconfidence. The United States stepped into Vietnam not because it planned to fight a long war, but because it believed it could afford not to lose. By the time soldiers arrived in large numbers, the most important decision had already been made. America had committed its money. And once that happened, military commitment was only a matter of time. The realization came too late. The nation was already financially invested before it was militarily trapped. By the time the Vietnam War entered its most intense phase, the United States was no longer deciding whether to pay for the war. It was deciding how. The question was not if money would be spent, but where it would come from and what consequences would follow. The answers to those questions quietly reshaped the American economy and destabilized the global financial system in ways that were not fully understood at the time. Unlike earlier conflicts, Vietnam was not funded through clear sacrifice at home. There were no dramatic tax increases aimed directly at the public. There were no large-scale war bonds marketed as patriotic duty. Instead, the war was financed through a combination of expanding military budgets, deficit spending, and money creation. This approach made the costs less visible in the short term, but far more dangerous in the long run. At first, military spending increases appeared manageable. The United States had emerged from World War II with enormous productive capacity and economic momentum. Growth was strong, unemployment was low, and confidence in American financial power was high. Policymakers believed that the economy was large enough to absorb the cost of a limited war without significant disruption. That belief proved to be a costly miscalculation. As troop levels increased and combat operations expanded, the military budget grew rapidly. Funding was required not only for soldiers, but for transportation, equipment, weapons production, fuel, medical care, logistics, and long-term support. Vietnam was geographically distant, which made every aspect of the war more expensive. Supplying a war on the other side of the world required massive infrastructure and constant spending. Year after year, military budgets exceeded previous projections. What had been described as a limited engagement became a full-scale financial commitment. The numbers were no longer small adjustments. They were structural changes to federal spending. Rather than raising taxes enough to cover these costs, the government chose to run deficits. Deficit spending allowed the war to continue without immediate public backlash. The financial burden was delayed, spread across time, rather than confronted directly. This decision made political sense, but came with serious economic consequences. Deficit spending meant that the government was spending more than it collected in revenue. To cover the difference, it borrowed money. Some of this borrowing came from domestic sources. Some came from foreign governments that held American dollars as reserves. Over time, borrowing became routine rather than exceptional. As deficits grew, another tool was increasingly used: money creation. The Federal Reserve played a critical role in this process. By expanding the money supply, it helped ensure that the government could finance its spending without immediate financial collapse. This strategy did not involve printing physical cash in a literal sense. It involved credit expansion, bond purchases, and monetary policies that increased the availability of dollars in the system. This approach created the illusion of sustainability. More money in circulation made it easier to pay bills, fund operations, and maintain economic activity. However, increasing the money supply without corresponding increases in production leads to inflation. Prices rise because there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. At first, inflation appeared mild. It was easy to dismiss as a temporary side effect of growth. Over time, it became impossible to ignore. Prices began to rise across the economy. Everyday goods became more expensive. Wages struggled to keep pace. The cost of living increased, particularly for working families. These pressures did not appear suddenly, but they accumulated steadily, eroding purchasing power and public confidence. Federal debt also climbed. Each year of deficit spending added to the national debt. While the United States had carried debt before, Vietnam changed the scale and nature of that burden. The war did not end quickly. It did not provide economic returns. It did not stimulate domestic production in the way World War II had. World War II had mobilized the entire economy. Factories expanded, employment surged, and technological innovation accelerated. The war effort itself helped fuel long-term growth. Vietnam did not have the same effect. It was expensive without being transformative. It consumed resources without rebuilding the economy. This distinction mattered. Vietnam was different because it occurred alongside ambitious domestic spending programs. At the same time the government was funding a distant war, it was also investing in social initiatives at home. Programs aimed at reducing poverty, expanding education, and improving healthcare required significant funding. This created a direct conflict. Resources devoted to war were resources not available for domestic priorities. The government attempted to do both by borrowing and expanding the money supply. This approach postponed hard choices, but it intensified economic strain. As inflation increased, social programs became more expensive to maintain. Budgets that looked sufficient on paper were eroded by rising costs. Public dissatisfaction grew as people felt the impact of inflation without fully understanding its source. The phrase "guns and butter" came to represent this dilemma. The nation was trying to fund both military expansion and domestic prosperity simultaneously. Historically, this balance had proven difficult to sustain. Vietnam pushed it to the breaking point. The financial strain was not limited to the United States. Because the dollar sat at the center of the global monetary system, American decisions affected the entire world. Under the post-war financial order, other countries held dollars as reserves. They trusted that those dollars could be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. This promise formed the foundation of global confidence in the dollar. As the United States increased spending and expanded the money supply, more dollars flowed into the global economy. Foreign governments began to notice that the number of dollars in circulation was growing much faster than American gold reserves. This imbalance created doubt. If every dollar could be exchanged for gold, then the United States needed enough gold to back them. As deficits grew and spending continued, that promise became increasingly difficult to honor. The Vietnam War accelerated this problem dramatically. Foreign governments started to question whether the United States could maintain its commitments. Some began converting dollars into gold. American gold reserves declined. This was not a public crisis yet, but it was a warning sign. The cracks in the global monetary system were forming. These cracks were not caused by Vietnam alone, but the war widened them. It magnified existing weaknesses and exposed assumptions that had gone unchallenged for decades. The belief that the United States could finance unlimited commitments without consequences began to falter. Inside government circles, concern grew. Officials understood that continued deficit spending and monetary expansion carried risks. They worried about inflation, currency stability, and international confidence. Yet they also feared the consequences of reducing war spending or raising taxes sharply. Each option carried political and economic costs. Reducing war spending risked military failure and loss of credibility. Raising taxes risked public backlash and economic slowdown. Maintaining the current path seemed easier, at least in the short term. So the cycle continued. More spending required more borrowing. More borrowing encouraged more money creation. More money creation fueled inflation. Inflation increased pressure on wages and social programs. Debt accumulated quietly year after year. Vietnam became a war financed by postponement. Instead of confronting costs directly, the United States borrowed time. It pushed consequences into the future, assuming they could be managed later. This strategy relied on continued confidence in the dollar and American leadership. That confidence was not infinite. As the war dragged on, international observers watched closely. Allies and rivals alike evaluated American economic stability. The question was no longer only whether the United States could win the war. It was whether it could afford its global role. By the late 1960s, tension was building beneath the surface. Inflation was rising. Debt was expanding. Gold reserves were shrinking. Trust in the financial system was weakening. The Vietnam War had moved beyond the battlefield. It was now a threat to the economic foundation of American power. A breaking point was approaching. The decisions made to fund the war had set forces in motion that could not be easily reversed. The global financial system, built on post-war assumptions, was under strain. Something would have to change. The only question was when, and how violently, the system would respond. As the next chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that the war's most lasting impact would not be measured in territory or treaties, but in a moment when the world's monetary order finally cracked under the weight of borrowed time. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had grown far beyond a regional conflict in Southeast Asia. It had become a global financial stress test, a war not only fought with rifles, artillery, and bombs, but also with balance sheets, bonds, and dollars. The United States, once confident in its economic supremacy, now faced mounting pressures that threatened to undermine its position as the central pillar of the post-World War II financial system. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were becoming tangible, visible to anyone who looked closely at the world's monetary flows and the health of the dollar. To understand how the Vietnam War contributed to a global financial crisis, it is necessary first to grasp the framework within which the world economy operated, the Bretton Woods system. Established in 1944 at a conference in New Hampshire during the final years of World War II, Bretton Woods was designed to create stability in international finance after the chaos of the interwar period and the Great Depression. Under this system, most currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was convertible into gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This arrangement made the dollar the de facto global reserve currency. It allowed other countries to trade with confidence and provided the United States with unparalleled financial influence. The brilliance of Bretton Woods was that it married American economic dominance with the appearance of stability and trust. Countries could rely on the dollar as a safe intermediary, and the United States could finance both domestic programs and global commitments at relatively low cost. Dollars flowed around the world as the linchpin of international trade, investment, and reserve holdings. The system worked because the world trusted that the United States could honor its commitments. The Vietnam War, however, began to strain that trust. Financing an expensive, protracted war required enormous sums of money, far beyond what had been anticipated. Military expenditures increased year after year, compounding the fiscal deficit that had already been building since the early stages of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Initially, the United States could cover the cost through borrowing and money creation, giving the appearance that the system was stable. The dollar remained strong, and inflation at home was only beginning to show. But each additional dollar spent in Vietnam was a dollar that left the domestic economy for foreign suppliers, contractors, or troops abroad, effectively exporting inflation and economic pressure. Foreign governments holding U.S. dollars began to notice the shift. Countries such as France, Germany, and Switzerland held significant dollar reserves. They relied on the Bretton Woods promise they could exchange these dollars for gold at the fixed rate. For years, these governments had trusted that the U.S. would maintain a disciplined fiscal and monetary policy, ensuring that the amount of dollars in circulation would not outpace the gold backing. As the costs of the Vietnam War mounted, confidence began to waver. Dollars accumulated overseas, often beyond the United States' immediate control. The government continued to finance the war with printed money and borrowed funds, and foreign central banks increasingly questioned whether the U.S. could honor the promise of gold conversion. In effect, every additional dollar spent in Vietnam increased the risk that holders of dollar reserves would demand gold. By the late 1960s, these fears were no longer theoretical. Foreign governments began presenting requests for gold conversion in growing numbers. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, famously denounced the United States for flooding the world with dollars that were no longer fully backed by gold. Other countries quietly followed suit. Gold reserves, once the backbone of American financial credibility, began to decline rapidly. Behind closed doors, American policymakers panicked. Treasury officials, Federal Reserve members, and White House advisors convened repeatedly to assess the situation. The numbers were alarming. Each month, gold reserves dropped, while the stock of dollars held abroad swelled. The deficit in the balance of payments had widened, and projections suggested that unless action was taken, the United States would soon lose its ability to maintain gold convertibility. The Nixon administration faced a dilemma without easy solutions. Maintaining the status quo risked a catastrophic run on gold. Countries could theoretically redeem their dollars en masse, draining the U.S. Treasury of its gold reserves and forcing a collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Tightening fiscal policy or raising taxes could reduce spending, but politically it was almost impossible. Pulling troops from Vietnam would reduce costs in the long term, but military and political pressures demanded continued engagement. Every option had consequences that seemed politically, economically, or militarily unacceptable. Internal debates were intense. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman William Martin, and other senior officials argued late into the night over the options. Some advocated for austerity measures, but the political cost was enormous. Others warned that continued deficits would erode confidence in the dollar. Yet others argued that aggressive measures to stabilize the currency could trigger a domestic recession. The reality was that the war, which had started as a regional conflict, now dictated the global financial future of the United States. As the pressure mounted, the U.S. began to experiment with temporary fixes. Currency interventions were used to buy time, interest rates were adjusted to attract foreign capital, and policymakers hoped to restore confidence through signals rather than structural changes. But these measures could only postpone the inevitable. Every month that the war continued, the strain increased. Dollars continued to accumulate overseas. Gold reserves continued to decline. The imbalance was becoming unsustainable. It was not merely a domestic concern. The credibility of a U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency was at stake. International trade, investment, and financial stability all depended on faith in the dollar. If confidence eroded, global markets could spiral into chaos. The war that had begun in Southeast Asia was now threatening to shake the entire post-war economic order. Analysts within the administration realized a stark truth. Vietnam had transformed from a military engagement into an economic pressure cooker. The costs of fighting were not only measured in lives lost or bombs dropped, but in dollars, reserves, and international trust. Every escalation of the war magnified the financial exposure of the United States. Publicly, the administration continued to emphasize the military and ideological rationale, containing communism, defending democracy, and supporting South Vietnam. Privately, the calculations were far more concrete. How many billions of dollars could be spent before the system collapsed? And how long could the U.S. maintain its global leadership in finance while financing an unwinnable war? The juxtaposition of public narrative and private reality highlighted a fundamental contradiction. The war was presented as a noble effort to defend freedom abroad, but simultaneously, it was undermining the financial foundations of American power at home and around the world. The irony was stark. The more the U.S. invested in the war to demonstrate strength and credibility, the more it risked losing the very financial leverage that had made it powerful. By 1970, signs of financial strain were undeniable. Inflation in the United States was rising faster than anticipated, and gold outflows continued unabated. International confidence was fragile, and internal memos warned that any significant escalation or misstep could provoke a crisis of trust. Policymakers understood that the war was no longer just a political or military issue, it was a currency crisis waiting to happen. The pressure on the dollar was compounded by global economic dynamics. Europe and Japan were rebuilding and expanding, accumulating trade surpluses, and holding dollars that were increasingly at risk. The growing imbalance between dollars in circulation and U.S. gold reserves was a ticking clock. If foreign governments collectively decided to convert their dollars into gold, the United States would face a sudden, catastrophic depletion of its reserves. As the administration watched the numbers, the stakes became clear. Every military escalation in Vietnam now carried not only human and political consequences, but also an immediate threat to financial stability. The war had become a direct determinant of international economic order. Failure to manage the economic side of the conflict could trigger a crisis far larger than anything anticipated in Southeast Asia. At the same time, domestic pressures were mounting. The American public increasingly questioned the costs of the war. Anti-war protests gained momentum, calling attention not only to human casualties but also to the economic burden on society. The disconnect between the public's perception and the administration's private anxieties created a tense environment in which decisions had to balance politics, economics, and military strategy. The situation was a convergence of multiple forces: military escalation, domestic discontent, rising inflation, gold outflows, and global economic confidence. Each factor reinforced the others, creating a momentum that was almost impossible to slow. It was no longer a question of whether the war could be won on the battlefield. The real question had shifted to whether the United States could maintain its financial credibility in the face of unprecedented fiscal pressure. As the months passed, the administration recognized an inescapable fact: the war in Vietnam had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply a regional conflict. It had become the war that threatened the dollar itself. Every additional operation, every troop deployment, every round of bombing contributed to an accelerating drain on gold reserves and an erosion of global confidence. And so, as 1971 approached, the United States stood at a critical juncture. Policymakers understood the stakes in ways the public could not fully appreciate. The Vietnam War, once framed as a military struggle to contain communism, had evolved into a financial struggle to preserve global leadership. The military and ideological objectives had been overshadowed by economic imperatives. The choices before the administration were stark and limited: either dramatically reduce the war effort, risk political backlash, and attempt to stabilize the economy, or continue the war and face a mounting crisis that could shake the foundations of the global financial system. There were no easy solutions, no comfortable compromises. At this moment, history was poised on the edge of a precipice. The pressure on the dollar had reached a point where the next decision, whether taken deliberately or forced by circumstance, would determine the course of international finance for decades. The war in Vietnam had become inseparable from the fate of the American economy and the global monetary order. The United States now faced the stark realization: the war was no longer just about ideology, containment, or military strategy. It had become a financial war with global consequences, a war that could break the dollar, undermine trust in the American economy, and fundamentally alter the post-World War II international order. The pieces were in place. The tension had reached a crescendo. The only remaining question was how and when the system would finally respond. Vietnam was no longer a distant conflict. It had become the war that threatened the very foundation of American global leadership. The events that would follow in 1971 were the inevitable consequence of years of spending, borrowing, and trusting that the system could hold. The war had set the stage for a financial reckoning, one that would ripple across the globe and leave no aspect of the international monetary system untouched. As the administration wrestled with these truths behind closed doors, history was about to arrive at a turning point. The U.S. dollar, long the symbol of stability and economic dominance, was now under threat. Gold reserves were declining, confidence was wavering, and the Bretton Woods system was strained to its breaking point. In this high-stakes environment, the choices of a few men in Washington would shape the financial destiny of nations. The world was on the cusp of a 1971 monetary shock, a moment that would force the United States to confront the costs of Vietnam not only in lives and politics, but in dollars, gold, and the very credibility of its global economic leadership. Vietnam, which had begun as a struggle in a distant jungle, had grown into a financial crisis capable of shaking the world. And at this moment, the full scale of the war's impact on the U.S. dollar was about to be revealed. By the early months of 1971, the United States faced a moment of unprecedented economic tension. The Vietnam War, which had begun as a regional military engagement, had grown into a global financial stress test, testing not only the limits of domestic fiscal policy, but also the integrity of the post-World War II monetary system. The pressures on the U.S. dollar had been building for years, largely invisible to the general public, but painfully evident to policymakers. Gold reserves were dwindling, international confidence in the dollar was faltering, and the once solid Bretton Woods system that had governed global finance for nearly 3 decades teetered on the brink of collapse. At the heart of the crisis was a fundamental imbalance. The United States had committed itself to a war that was costing tens of billions of dollars annually, financed primarily through deficit spending and monetary expansion. At home, inflation was rising steadily, threatening domestic economic stability. Abroad, other nations, France, Germany, Switzerland, and Japan, among others, held massive amounts of U.S. dollars as reserves. Under Bretton Woods, these dollars could be exchanged for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. For years, this arrangement had worked, largely because the dollar was strong and the U.S. economy was robust. However, the combination of war spending, domestic inflation, and international distrust was now threatening to make that system unsustainable. The signs of trouble had been mounting for some time. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly criticized the United States for creating an imbalance in the global monetary system. De Gaulle insisted that dollars held abroad should be redeemable for gold, arguing that the United States could not continue to issue currency without consequences. His warnings were not isolated. Central banks across the globe began quietly converting dollars into gold reserves, steadily draining U.S. holdings. Every ounce of gold that left the Treasury brought the United States closer to a point of no return. The Nixon administration faced a dilemma of extraordinary complexity. Domestically, reducing war expenditures would have required massive cuts to military operations in Vietnam, a politically unpalatable move. It would have meant admitting publicly that the war could not continue under the current financial strain. Internationally, any attempt to defend the dollar without addressing the structural imbalances would risk a collapse in confidence, potentially triggering a run on U.S. gold reserves and destabilizing the entire global financial system. Every option available was fraught with consequences. Behind closed doors, heated debates raged among the president's advisors. Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman William Martin, and other key policymakers explored every conceivable solution, from tightening domestic monetary policy to imposing capital controls on dollars leaving the United States. Each potential measure came with its own costs. Raising interest rates could slow inflation but might also trigger a recession. Imposing controls could prevent gold outflows temporarily, but would undermine the United States' reputation for financial openness and stability. Cutting military spending risked alienating political allies and emboldening the North Vietnamese. Meanwhile, inflation in the United States continued to rise, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Americans. Prices for goods and services increased steadily, and the cost of living placed pressure on households across the country. Social programs, which had been expanded during the 1960s under initiatives like the Great Society, now competed for resources with the enormous cost of war. The economic strain was becoming evident not only internationally, but domestically, threatening the political stability of the country itself. On the international stage, the effects were equally profound. Nations holding large dollar reserves began to question the sustainability of Bretton Woods. Confidence in the fixed exchange rate system faltered, and the risk of a massive conversion of dollars into gold loomed large. If the United States failed to meet its obligations, the consequences would extend far beyond Vietnam. Global trade, investment, and financial stability all relied on the credibility of the U.S. dollar. A collapse would not only undermine American influence, but could trigger a worldwide economic crisis. By the summer of 1971, the situation had reached a critical point. Gold reserves had fallen to dangerously low levels, and the United States faced mounting pressure from foreign governments to honor their right to convert dollars into gold. The Treasury's ability to meet these demands was increasingly limited. Every day that the war continued, every additional dollar spent on military operations in Southeast Asia increased the risk that the financial system could unravel. President Richard Nixon and his advisors recognized that decisive action was necessary. The costs of inaction were too great. The stakes were clear. Failure to address the imbalance would not only undermine the domestic economy, but could also dismantle the entire international financial system built since the end of World War II. The United States, which had long enjoyed the privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency, faced the possibility of losing that advantage forever. The administration considered a range of options. One possibility was to negotiate with foreign governments to maintain the gold standard temporarily, promising reforms and structural adjustments to restore confidence. Another was to impose temporary controls on capital outflows, preventing foreign nations from converting dollars into gold too rapidly. A more drastic option involved unilaterally abandoning the gold standard, effectively allowing the dollar to float freely and freeing the United States from the constraints of fixed exchange rates. Each choice carried enormous implications. Negotiations might buy time, but did not solve the underlying imbalance between dollars issued and gold reserves held. Controls could slow the outflow but would damage credibility and might invite retaliation. Abandoning the gold standard would end the Bretton Woods system, disrupt global trade, and trigger significant financial turbulence. There was no risk-free solution. The United States was trapped by the very structure it had helped create after World War II. The tension within the administration was compounded by the realities of war. Troop morale, domestic protests, and the political ramifications of reducing military engagement in Vietnam complicated the economic decision-making process. Nixon had to consider the interplay between domestic politics, military strategy, and international finance. The Vietnam War, originally conceived as a limited regional conflict, had grown to dominate every aspect of American policy, military, political, and financial. Finally, in August 1971, the administration acted. Nixon announced a series of measures that would collectively become known as the Nixon shock. Most significantly, the United States suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. This bold, unprecedented move allowed the dollar to float freely in the global market, freeing the United States from the immediate threat of gold outflows, but fundamentally transforming the international financial system. The immediate reaction was intense. Financial markets experienced turbulence as investors and central banks adjusted to the new reality. Countries that had relied on the dollar-gold peg were forced to reconsider their policies, revalue their currencies, and adapt to a new era of floating exchange rates. The United States retained significant influence, but the symbolic and practical foundation of its financial leadership had shifted. The broader implications of the monetary shock were profound. By severing the dollar from gold, the United States gained short-term fiscal flexibility, allowing it to continue funding military operations and domestic programs without the immediate constraint of gold reserves. However, the move also introduced a new level of uncertainty into the global economy. Exchange rates became more volatile, international trade required new mechanisms for stability, and trust in the predictability of American monetary policy had to be rebuilt. From a historical perspective, the 1971 monetary shock revealed the direct financial consequences of prolonged war. Vietnam had not only consumed human and political resources, but had also placed unprecedented pressure on the global financial system. The war had transformed the dollar from a symbol of stability into a source of instability, forcing the United States to confront the limits of its economic power. The lesson was clear. Prolonged, expensive wars have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. The Vietnam War, though fought in a distant country with relatively few immediate casualties for the global economy, created structural pressures that forced a fundamental reorganization of international finance. The conflict demonstrated how military commitments, fiscal policies, and global financial obligations are inextricably linked. The monetary shock also underscored the hidden costs of war. While policymakers often focus on battlefield outcomes and geopolitical objectives, the economic dimensions of conflict are equally consequential. Vietnam had drained resources, contributed to domestic inflation, strained political credibility, and ultimately forced the United States to abandon a nearly 3-decade-old system that had been the foundation of post-war stability. In the years that followed, the end of Bretton Woods reshaped global finance. Floating exchange rates became the norm, international trade adjusted to new realities, and countries developed more sophisticated mechanisms to manage currency volatility. The lessons of 1971 continue to resonate today. Fiscal mismanagement, prolonged military engagement, and unrestrained debt accumulation can have consequences far beyond national borders. In retrospect, the monetary shock was as much a product of policy decisions as it was of structural inevitability. The Vietnam War accelerated trends that were already placing pressure on the dollar, but policymakers' inability to anticipate long-term consequences magnified the risk. The disconnect between the political desire to sustain a costly war and the financial reality of mounting deficits created a perfect storm that culminated in the historic break with gold. By suspending the gold standard, Nixon effectively acknowledged a hard truth. The costs of war were not only measured in lives lost or territory gained, but in the stability of nations and the global economic order. The monetary shock was a stark reminder that wars have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield, influencing the economic and political futures of nations in ways that are often invisible until crisis forces recognition. The Vietnam War, therefore, cannot be understood solely as a military or political conflict. Its financial ramifications reshaped the United States and the world, forcing policymakers to confront the interconnectedness of war, debt, and economic leadership. The monetary shock of 1971 was the tipping point, a dramatic illustration of how prolonged military spending can strain even the most powerful nation's economy and provoke fundamental change in global finance. In sum, the events of 1971 marked the intersection of military conflict and financial crisis. The war in Vietnam, which had begun as a regional ideological struggle, had transformed into a global economic problem. By ending dollar convertibility into gold, the United States forced the world to confront the economic realities of prolonged conflict and exposed the fragile underpinnings of international finance. The monetary shock changed everything. It altered global economic structures, redefined U.S. financial authority, and underscored the hidden costs of war in ways that would resonate for decades to come. The Vietnam War and its financial consequences offer far more than a historical lesson. They provide a roadmap for understanding modern global conflicts, economic pressures, and the hidden forces that shape national and international decision-making. If we look carefully at the events leading to the 1971 monetary shock, the prolonged expenditure in Southeast Asia, and the financial unraveling that followed, a clear pattern emerges. Wars are never just about ideology, territory, or political disputes. They are deeply intertwined with debt, resource allocation, and economic incentives. Understanding this relationship is crucial if humanity is to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. One of the first lessons is the cost of underestimating financial obligations. The United States entered Vietnam believing that military dominance and technological superiority would ensure a rapid resolution. In reality, the economic implications of the conflict were immense. Each dollar spent on military operations carried not only a direct cost, but a ripple effect. It added to federal deficits, strained the domestic economy, and destabilized confidence in the U.S. dollar internationally. Policymakers at the time failed to fully grasp how quickly financial pressures could cascade into a global crisis. Today, similar patterns are visible in prolonged engagements and escalating military commitments around the world. Countries accumulate debt to fund operations, often underestimating long-term consequences. The lesson is clear. Strategic decisions must include rigorous financial analysis alongside political and military considerations. Ignoring this can transform a local or regional conflict into a destabilizing force for entire economies. Another critical lesson is the importance of transparency and public awareness. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the connection between the war and economic strain was largely invisible to the American public. Inflation, deficits, and mounting debt were present, but the scale and consequences were obscured by political rhetoric and media framing. Citizens believed they were supporting a noble cause while the financial realities remained hidden. Today, access to information is vastly improved, yet understanding is still limited. Complex financial systems, international debt arrangements, and hidden subsidies create opaque decision-making. The Vietnam War demonstrates that if citizens are unaware of the economic underpinnings of war, they are less likely to question policy or demand alternatives. Educating the public about the real costs, both human and financial, can serve as a check against unnecessary or prolonged conflict. A society that understands the financial stakes is more likely to demand accountability and resist being drawn into avoidable wars. The Vietnam experience also highlights the risks of structural dependence on debt and borrowing. By financing the war primarily through deficit spending, the United States amplified its vulnerability. The country became trapped in a cycle, spending more money to fight the war while creating domestic inflation and international pressures that worsened the financial imbalance. Today, many nations face similar vulnerabilities. Global debt has skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, and military expenditures continue to rise. Resource competition, technological arms races, and strategic alliances all carry financial obligations that can create systemic risks if left unchecked. The lesson is that debt is not neutral, it is a strategic force. Decisions about engaging in or sustaining conflicts must account for how borrowing shapes both immediate and long-term national stability. A fourth lesson is the interconnectedness of global economies. The post-World War II financial system, anchored by Bretton Woods and the U.S. dollar, created a world in which national economic decisions had international consequences. Vietnam accelerated tensions in that system, demonstrating how a regional conflict could undermine global confidence in a currency and force the re-evaluation of an international monetary order. Today, global finance is even more interconnected. A prolonged conflict in one part of the world, whether military, economic, or cyber, can trigger financial shocks across continents. The lesson is that national security is inseparable from financial security. Policymakers must consider how decisions will ripple through global markets, trade networks, and international alliances. Ignoring these linkages is not merely irresponsible, it is dangerous. The war also teaches the danger of assuming inevitability or underestimating the human cost. Policymakers in Vietnam believed that military intervention was necessary to contain communism, that prolonged involvement could be managed, and that domestic economic effects could be controlled. Each assumption proved flawed. Wars escalate in unpredictable ways, and their consequences, human, financial, and political, often exceed expectations. Today, this lesson resonates in ongoing conflicts worldwide. Governments may act under assumptions of control, but the Vietnam experience reminds us that escalation, both military and financial, often exceeds projections. Strategic humility, acknowledging uncertainty, and the potential for unintended consequences, is essential for modern leadership. The Vietnam War also illustrates the importance of reassessing alliances and global commitments. Just as U.S. intervention replaced France's colonial presence in Vietnam, modern powers are often drawn into conflicts due to historical obligations, treaty commitments, or perceived geopolitical interests. Such obligations carry financial implications as well as strategic ones. The cost of intervention is not limited to immediate military spending. It includes long-term obligations, debt servicing, economic disruption, and domestic social costs. Before committing to new engagements, nations must evaluate the total financial footprint of their decisions. Without this analysis, well-intentioned policies can inadvertently create long-term vulnerability and global instability. A sixth lesson is the significance of economic leverage and the hidden influence of financial institutions. During Vietnam, banks, industrial interests, and government creditors all had stakes in the continuity of U.S. financial commitments. Policies were shaped not solely by ideology or military strategy, but by the need to maintain fiscal credibility and the flow of capital. Today, similar dynamics persist. Global corporations, banks, and investors wield influence over national and international decisions. Recognizing the economic drivers behind policy choices allows citizens, scholars, and policymakers to better understand why certain conflicts escalate or persist. Financial literacy in this context becomes a form of strategic awareness, revealing the often invisible mechanisms that sustain conflicts. The lessons of Vietnam extend to the management of domestic resources as well. Wartime spending competed directly with social programs, infrastructure, and investments in education and public health. In effect, financial prioritization decisions became moral choices: allocate funds to prolong war or to sustain societal well-being. This tension continues today. Military expenditure is still frequently weighed against domestic needs. Policymakers must recognize that decisions about funding priorities carry both economic and ethical implications. Failure to balance these priorities can exacerbate social inequality, undermine public trust, and create conditions for domestic unrest. Finally, the Vietnam experience teaches that bold action may be necessary to prevent systemic collapse. The Nixon administration's monetary policies, though controversial, were designed to stabilize an unstable system. They highlight the principle that waiting too long to address structural imbalances, whether fiscal, monetary, or geopolitical, can magnify the eventual crisis. Proactive, informed, and decisive action is often required to prevent catastrophe, and it is rarely simple or politically convenient. Applying this lesson today means addressing debt, military spending, and resource management proactively rather than reactively. It means reforming international financial structures to mitigate systemic risks before they escalate into crises that threaten not only economic stability, but global security. In conclusion, the Vietnam War, when viewed through the lens of finance, debt, and economic pressure, provides timeless insights. Wars are never merely battles of ideology. They are battles over resources, economic leverage, and fiscal stability. Policymakers must consider the long-term financial implications of military engagement, the global interconnectedness of economies, the influence of institutions, and the human and societal costs of prolonged conflict. Citizens must demand transparency, accountability, and a fuller understanding of the economic stakes behind war. If we internalize these lessons, there is hope for a different path forward. A path where conflicts are assessed not only through military and political lenses, but through the financial realities that drive them. A path where nations prioritize sustainable economic policies, responsible fiscal management, and international cooperation to prevent escalation. A path where the mistakes of Vietnam, the human suffering, the economic strain, the destabilization of global systems, inform present-day choices, guiding leaders and citizens alike toward solutions that avert unnecessary wars. The Vietnam War is therefore not merely history. It is a warning, a blueprint, and a challenge. The hidden financial battles, the debt-driven decisions, and the systemic pressures that shape the conflict are mirrored in today's geopolitical landscape. Recognizing these parallels empowers us to make informed decisions, resist the repetition of historical errors, and strive for a future in which wars are no longer inevitable, preventable not just through diplomacy, but through economic awareness, systemic reform, and collective responsibility. The choices we make now, armed with historical knowledge and financial insight, will determine whether the next generation inherits stability or chaos. The ultimate lesson of Vietnam is clear. History does not have to repeat itself, but only if we are willing to see, understand, and act upon the hidden forces that shape our world. War is not inevitable. Financial pressures are not destiny. Debt is not fate. By following the patterns that history reveals, demanding transparency, and prioritizing systemic reform, humanity has the opportunity to navigate a safer, more stable, and more just future. Vietnam teaches us that understanding the past is not merely an academic exercise, it is a moral and strategic imperative for survival in the modern world.